But after 20 minutes, the movie stops trying to tell a story and starts trying to build a franchise. And it falls apart. There's not enough base there. There's no foundation of 2 or 3 or 4 films, the way Marvel had, by the way, to support all of these characters getting thrown in there. This is the Box Office Podcast. I'm Danny Loria, the editorial director of Box Office Pro, the pulse of theatrical exhibition. And in this week's episode, we are going to be going over the box office history of Superman, looking over the entire Superman series at the movies. I will be joined by Russ Fischer, and making his debut appearance on the podcast, our colleague and my high school friend, Diogo Hausen, joining us for that conversation. But before we get there, I'm joined by my colleague Chad Kennerk from Box Office Pro to go over the box office numbers from last weekend, which saw Jurassic World Rebirth take first place with a $91 million debut. And we'll also be previewing the opening weekend for Superman coming out on Friday. Chad, welcome back to the podcast. Good holiday weekend for you?
Yeah, good family time. I did get out to see Jurassic World Rebirth. Fun popcorn movie. Great one for the summer season. Also, not my favorite in the franchise. It's kind of a throwback in terms of sharing a lot of those original hallmarks from the first film, but nothing really new.
Yeah, I was afraid that it would be a big lift to distinguish itself from everything that's come before it. When we did the box office history of the Jurassic Park franchise on this podcast, when was it? A couple of years back, around the release of Jurassic World Dominion, Russ Fischer had mentioned that Jurassic Park is one of those weird franchises where everybody loves the first one so much that they forget the sequels suck. And it's a franchise that's been living off of fumes basically since then. But it's a very forgiving audience. An opening weekend on a 5-day basis, close to $150 million, within striking distance of that mark. Obviously, PLF numbers that were very impressive. A 3-day number that came in right in the middle of our $80 to $100 million range. So really along expectations, numbers that I think are going to help the box office in a month of July that we expect to be the strongest out of all year. The big challenge here, Chad, is going to be how much is it going to drop in week 2? Because Superman is flying into theaters and it's flying in with lofty expectations. We're currently tracking that title with an opening weekend between $115 to $135 million. That $115 million benchmark is the same number that Man of Steel opened with back in, when was that, 2013, if I'm not mistaken? And the ceiling around 135, which could honestly go higher because this thing has been all over the place. It could really take off and surprise us, but the sales just aren't there yet for us to think it's going to get into the 140s or beyond. Could happen by Sunday morning. We just don't know yet.
Well, I'm looking forward to this conversation because I'm not that well versed in the franchise. I think I've seen them all, but it's one of those franchises where I may have missed one or I forgot about one. So it'd be nice to hear the recap.
You would have remembered having seen Superman 3 and Superman 4 because they truly are challenges, let's put it that way, to sit through. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a good introduction to go into our supersized feature segment coming up after the break. I'm joined by Diogo Hausen and Russ Fischer from the Box Office Company to talk about Superman at the movies and the box office, cultural and social history that those films have had on our industry. That is coming up right after this message from our sponsor.
Irwin Seating has been building and installing seating solutions in schools, stadiums, concert halls, and cinemas for 119 years. So it's safe to assume they've seen a thing or two. And safer still to assume that Irwin not only has the products you need, they have the experience, knowledge, and know-how to solve whatever problem you have that needs solving, regardless of the size of your cinema or your problem. To learn more about what Irwin has learned about cinema in the last 119 years, visit irwinseating.com.
And welcome back here on the Box Office Podcast. In this special look back at the box office history of Superman, we're going to be looking at not every appearance of the Superman in the cinema, but we are going to be looking at a lot of the movies where he is featured as a main character. It gets unwieldy. We'll try to keep sense of all this. Joining us here for the first time in his podcast debut, we've got Diogo Hausen, my colleague and high school friend. He is the movie guide editor over at the Box Office Company and probably the biggest Superman fan. Welcome, Diogo.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Happy to talk about Superman. Play my theme music.
There's no theme music. We can't afford
Why?
That. Yeah, no rights. No rights. It's all right. We'll call Hans because apparently Hans Zimmer will do anything for money, including some of these movies. And joining us here on the third mic from the Box Office Studios, my friend and colleague Russ Fischer, whom I have not seen a single movie together with, but we've probably overlapped on a lot of the things we've seen in our lives, Russ.
Almost certainly, yeah.
Including all of these Superman movies. Wow, do we have a lot to talk about today. Of course, this is being taped in advance of the release of Superman. No subtitle, just Superman. Superman 2025, probably how we're going to refer to it moving forward. And there's a lot of history to go over, guys, because I'm going to just come right out and say it. I think Superman might be if not a doomed franchise, it's a really difficult franchise to A, pull off, and B, sustain. There are more movies that didn't get made that require a lot of conversation and dialogue than there are of some movies that probably shouldn't have gotten made in the Superman saga. Let's go right into it. In 1978, in December 1978, with the release of Superman, the movie. I love the marketing campaign for this. You'll believe a man can fly. Russ, you were alive at that point. That's not something Diogo and I can say.
Yeah.
But you were probably very young when the first Superman comes out. What's your memory of all this? Because I know by the time Superman 2 comes around, you're of movie-going age.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, I saw Superman the movie in theaters. I was excited to see it. Although the first time I saw Superman in the theater, and I've told a version of this story on the podcast before, was I was desperate at the time to see Alien. And my mom and a friend of hers and her friend's daughter, the four of us went to go see Superman finally. And we sat in the wrong theater, and it turned out to be at a theater that was still showing Alien. Or Alien had just opened. They were still showing Superman. I don't remember exactly the timeline. But we sat in, and it's like space credits come up. Oh, it's Alien. It's not Superman. And I really wanted to stay and see Alien. We got pulled. My mom was like, no. I had a very good time with Superman. I still really like that first Richard Donner movie. So yeah, I mean, I was in on this kind of from, on this run of movies from the beginning, really.
It's a seminal movie in film history in the sense that it builds the blueprint of what would get perfected in the 90s and 2000s of the superhero origin story for the big screen, which is maybe very cliche and rote by this point. In fact, a lot of new movies with superheroes that come out skip the origin story altogether because we've seen so many variations of this. But Superman was able to introduce this blueprint in a way that it had never been done before. And it's actually a lot trickier and harder than it looks, mostly for the fact that Superman had been in various stages of rumors and developments for many years until finally a pair of independent producers get their hands on the rights, find a distribution partner with Warner Brothers, decide to put up their own money along with investment that they had to raise to make the film, with a negative pickup deal coming from Warner Brothers in putting up their end of the cash once the film is completed and turned in. At that point, Warner Brothers distributes it. But let's not make any bones about this. Superman 1978 is an independent production and very much feels like a producer movie instead of a studio movie. So going back to this coming to theaters to begin with ends up being a massive endeavor, which we'll try to recap as quickly as possible because, Russ, the production history on this one is a mess.
It is. Well, and that kind of sets the stage for modern Superman movies overall, right? Like this one, they ended up conceiving the idea of filming two movies back to back with director Richard Donner. Donner eventually, before the second movie is released or even finished, has a full falling out with the producers, which kind of changes the entire direction of what might have been a very different film series. But I mean, I don't think we even have time to go into all the difficulties. You're talking about, they're putting this into production just as Star Wars is coming out. Modern special effects, such as they are in their infancy. You've got to do flying effects, which there were Superman movies in the 40s and 50s, some of which, like the 1948 serial, super successful. But they used animation for the flying because they just couldn't get it right. And so here it's like, how do we, you've got the tagline, you will believe a man can fly. And so they've got to make him fly. It goes over budget. It goes over schedule. Diogo, I don't know how much you know about the production history of this, probably quite a lot. So by all means, throw in or contradict me if I'm wrong, but it's a tough production. It's really difficult.
Yeah, they had no idea. They just invented so much for this, creating Krypton itself, all this space stuff, and just figuring out how to make a man fly was an amazing process. There's clips that you can see of them just shooting dummies out of cannons and seeing if that works. They started from absolute zero, and it's something we take for granted right now.
Narrator voice, shooting dummies out of cannons did not work.
No, unfortunately not. That would have been interesting. Would have made Superman 4 a better movie. But we'll get to Superman 4 in a little bit.
And then, you've got, that's before you even get to the cast. You've got Marlon Brando, famously not the easiest guy to work with.
Mm-hmm.
No, not at all. Not in the least bit. I mean, really, everything from top to bottom in making the first Superman movies a minor miracle. That it also kind of comes to pass that those production difficulties ultimately sinks the creative vision of where Superman can go beyond the first film. The origin of all of this relates back to something Russ mentioned in passing. The Salkind father and son production duo that came into the rights of this film and set out to make an independently financed and produced Superman movie came at it after their experience making The Three Musketeers, which is, I believe, a French film, big budget. They brought in Richard Lester, the filmmaker that at this time probably best known for making some of the Beatles movies. They have such an unwieldy script and they have so much in there that they decide to split up this Three Musketeers movies into two movies, The Three Musketeers and The Four Musketeers. And they realize that when you have a hot property like this one and you bring a director to basically make two movies shot simultaneously, shot at once, you're in a really good position, especially in finding a negative pickup deal with a distributor, to get that paid up front and get that distributed not only in the US, but other foreign markets. That's the sort of blueprint in tackling this. From there, you have to get a screenplay. And of course, you go get the rights for something like Superman, you're not going to phone it in, especially not right now. Eventually, the money runs out. And boy, does the money run out. But before the money runs out, you go to Mario Puzo, coming off of the success of The Godfather, and you hand him a bag full of money to write a story treatment on Superman. And he turns in an extremely unwieldy script, unbelievably ambitious, that needs to get reworked a number of times, to the point that Puzo never gets a proper screenwriting credit for this. I believe it's a story by credit up front. But they do approach the production from this let's shoot two movies at once strategy that they had already done. And they tried to get a cast together. In terms of a director, a number of names are bandied about. Eventually, someone watches The Omen, which is a great idea in case you've never seen The Omen. Go catch Richard Donner's The Omen. And they go, hey, this is a great guy to make a movie like this. Donner signs on, brings a more grounded, more human version of this comic book story onto the screen. Casting, a lot of big A-list names start getting thrown around for Superman. I mean, we're talking about basically anyone with name recognizability in the 1970s. So you had Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford and Paul Newman being thrown around as names, which you can see this movie in the 1970s with any of them. Actually, that actually makes sense when you think about this industry. They land on a theater actor that is unknown at the time, Christopher Reeve. He nails it, absolutely gets it right. But if you've got an unknown in your lead role, you kind of need star power to complement it. Is there a bigger star? Is there a bigger legend than Marlon Brando No, you kind of pay him what he wants, and you stick the cue cards whenever you can find, including on a human baby on set. And you basically cross your fingers and hope you get through without anyone getting arrested. And then on the other end, you got Gene Hackman, who's always game.
I just do need to interject for a second because, I don't want to completely pass over the directorial search because you've got obvious, they tried to get obvious people, Lucas, Spielberg, all these, and again, kind of like with the cast, any big name that you can go after in the 70s. They talked to Sam Peckinpah.
No.
Who was probably not ever really going to make this movie, but just the idea of a Sam Peckinpah directed Superman, which now I got to say, The Ballad of Cable Hogue, which he ended up making kind of around the same time, is like kind of a weirdly hopeful movie. And it's like, okay, maybe you could see some version of this kind of working, but like, oh yeah, from the director of The Wild Bunch comes Superman. Anyway. Let's move on.
It's a wild idea. I like it. And yeah, you're right. Is it that much of a far-fetched name to throw out there after getting the guy that made The Omen to come and make a big-budget, family-friendly superhero movie? Kind of seems counterintuitive. I think Donner shapes a lot of this and is responsible for where we are, in large part, for where we are today in the superhero genre. Donner is the one that brings his friend Tom Mankiewicz to work on the script. He helps usher in a lot of the actors that end up making the cast. Gene Hackman, very famously, playing Lex Luthor, gets along very well with Donner. Donner has a voice in bringing in, at this point, a B-movie actress, a scream queen in Margot Kidder, who I loved in Sisters, but watching her in Sisters, you would never guess that by the end of the decade, she's going to be Lois Lane. Pulls it off wonderfully. I think this movie really comes together once Donner gets involved. And man, this movie literally starts flying once you start producing all of this. There's a lot of stops and starts in terms of the logistics of getting this guy to fly. Diogo just mentioned shooting people out of cannons, making sure you can shoot in a place that will allow Marlon Brando to enter the country. Also difficult, because at this point, Brando is not welcome in a number of foreign nations, but somehow it starts working. I will fast forward through a lot of the turbulent production, but ultimately they do realize we're running out of money and we're running out of time for a 1978 release. So maybe instead of shooting 2 Superman movies simultaneously, why don't we put everything we shot on Superman 2 to the side and focus on getting the first one done and done right? Turns out they don't really have a good ending for the first one. So they take the ending for the second movie, kind of shoehorn it into the first one, awkwardly kind of patch together everything they can, and they release the best movie possible of whatever they had left, which very much seems rushed by the end of Superman Part 1 in mid-December 1978. I do want to hear from Diogo, in watching this like I did for the first time in home video, how was this introduction to the character for you removed from that release context?
Oh, for me, I watched it exactly how you said. It's at home on a VHS on my TV, and I was very confused by a lot of it.
How old were you? Like 5? Like 4?
Yeah, I think I was maybe a little older. I probably watched it when I was younger, but didn't pay that much attention. But I remember being a little older, maybe around 10 in the tweens era, and watching it. And I already had like an established image of Superman. I was an avid comic book reader. I loved the animated series. So seeing a Superman that could turn back time by flying around the world, I was like, how is this happening? This isn't one of his powers.
It still doesn't make any sense, Diogo. Spoiler alert. It still doesn't work now. It's still a ridiculous way to end a movie.
So yeah, the ending of that movie, just logically, like he reversed time, but there was still earthquakes, and it just seemed weird to me, even as a kid who didn't understand that the movie was kind of patched together.
It makes sense now that you know the production history, why it ends up playing the way it plays. But Russ, you didn't know any of this when you walk into a theater. Well, definitely when you walk into the wrong theater to watch Alien in 1978 or early 79. But we spent a wonderful episode looking back at the Batmania of that Tim Burton Batman from the 1980s. Before that, there was this Superman release in 1978. It was a risk, right? That's probably one of the least risky things you can do, make a movie about Superman. Well, I say that with an asterisk, but this was a massive risk in 78. Nobody knew if audiences would turn out. They spent a lot of their own money, the producers on this. Warner Brothers, a little bit less exposed because they didn't have to put up production costs, but they did put up the pretty penny to release it. What was the marketing vibe around something like Superman in an era of taxi drivers, sorcerers, and Jaws?
I mean, to be honest, I was too young at the time to give you any sort of realistic firsthand depiction of that or account of it. All I can say is I know that the movie was very successfully marketed to me, whereas Taxi Driver was not. I did not know Taxi Driver existed. I very much knew Superman existed, and I was excited to see it. And I don't think I got into comics until a few years later. So, I wasn't even kind of coming at it from that perspective, but I definitely had an awareness of the Superman character just from, whatever old cartoons were on TV and serial reruns and stuff like that. So I was excited, but, I can't give you an adult's perspective on what that marketing was like.
But that's relevant also in the sense that this is very much marketed as a family movie.
Oh, yes.
I think the marketing campaign draws from Star Wars, another B movie that has elements that maybe are a little bit dangerous or a little bit scary. That trash compactor scene in the first Star Wars, terrifying, right? That you wouldn't associate as a family movie. But the success ends up being this cross-quadrant hit that I do think Superman can't borrow, obviously, from Star Wars. They were being developed together for a while, but obviously Star Wars coming out in 77 and Superman coming out in 78. I do think Warner Brothers takes a lot of those 20th Century Fox marketing lessons in making this tentpole event film of an era.
And I think too, the success of this movie very much builds on the success of Star Wars. I think without the success of Star Wars, which primes an audience for this kind of fantastical, effects-based, pulpy genre thing, Superman has a harder time being as successful as it is. Star Wars, an audience in 1978 is ready for something else like Star Wars. At this point, I don't even know if people know that there's going to be another Star Wars movie or if they know when it's going to come out. So it's like everybody's kind of like, yeah, let's go when you get something like this that very clearly has a similar vibe. And then, approaching it like a family movie front, or the idea of approaching it like a family movie, I think that's very much seen like in the Lex Luthor character, where in the modern era, you get a villain that's much more overtly menacing. Whereas in this movie, you've got a Lex Luthor who's kind of goofy, you've got this like tuba based theme that goes along with some of his appearances.
Is this like hacky New York real estate developers ripping people off with a huge ego that thinks he's the smartest guy in the room? At the time, I am talking about Lex Luthor, by the way, and Gene Hackman's characterization. At the time, you look at someone like that and you can recognize him as ridiculous. I'm not sure that character would have the same reception today in one of the movies.
Yeah, well, that was my main problem watching that as a kid. I just couldn't recognize the Lex Luthor with the hair, even though they were wigs, and the jokes.
That's still my issue with the Donner movies, or with, the first two movies, we'll put it that way, and whichever cut of Superman 2 you watch. I know this kind of puts me at odds with a lot of people who enjoy these movies. I do not like Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor. I don't like it at all. And the fact that it's Hackman gives that character whatever sort of appeal it might have, because you can see that Hackman is doing stuff with it. But I don't like the writing. I don't like how any of it's positioned. None of it works for me. And it's the biggest difficulty I have with both of these movies. And it's the thing that really helps sink Superman 2 for me, because that movie already faces all sorts of other problems. So without the strengths and the purity of the first movie, the problems I have with these movies' version of Lex Luthor come very much to the forefront in the sequel.
And it's interesting because both stars that they get basically counteract the fact that they have an unknown playing Superman. Both Brando and Hackman, I don't think work here. I think they're both unengaged. I think it's obvious that they're maybe not explicitly, but you do get a sense that they are slumming it in this movie. They never elevate the material. It somehow feels like Hackman is above the material, and so is Brando, which, in my opinion, that's not how great actors work in genre movies, which is what this is. You're supposed to be there to elevate this. I don't think Hackman ever gets there in any of his outings as Lex Luthor. And Marlon Brando was happy to get a paycheck. I mean, Marlon Brando, seriously, literally reading out cue cards taped to a baby.
Yeah.
At this point, Brando's not in it for the right reasons. And late career Brando, I don't enjoy any of his post-Apocalypse Now performances. I don't find them interesting. By all measures, does not seem like a good guy to be around at this point in his life.
Yeah, that's I would go with that. And I think Hackman is kind of like, there are other actors who are like this. I think if Hackman is simpatico with the director, and the thing is, supposedly he was with Donner. Hackman will kind of would give you a lot more, is the impression that I've gotten. Whereas if he didn't really respect the director, he was just going to do whatever he wanted to do, and tough shit, you got to deal with it. Supposedly he and Donner got along really well, but maybe they just vibed on this whole goofy thing, and I don't know. It doesn't work for me, and I think it's this movie's biggest liability.
It seems that Gene Hackman respected Richard Donner a lot. I just don't feel like he really respected the character a lot.
Yeah.
From the get-go, he was very much like, I want to keep my hair and I want to have a mustache during the movie.
Right.
And they were like,
whatever you want in the script. I
No.
keep my hair, I keep my mustache. Yeah, this isn't the same actor that was great in The Conversation in 1974 and great in Night Moves in 1975. It's not that same guy. You're getting a guy, I hate to say it, especially after his passing, great actor, but in the Superman movies, I know people have great memories of him. I think he's phoning it in. Brando is definitely phoning it in. Brando
100%.
phoned it in for decades near the end.
Yeah.
But this is the rare Hackman portrayal where it feels more like a paycheck than a performance.
And I mean, the one thing I'll say in his defense is this is still of an era when a comic book movie did not demand to be taken seriously. We're in the legacy of the Batman TV series. We're still in the immediate shadow of there's these weird TV movie adaptations of a couple of the Marvel characters. You've got stuff like this, and all of it is like camp. That camp is really the defining quality that most people seem to either bring to the table or be willing to accept with movies derived from comic books. You get it eventually with the Flash Gordon adaptation. You get it with a lot of the post-Star Wars kind of sci-fi fantasy stuff that hits in the 80s. And the big exceptions here are Christopher Reeve and Margot Kidder, who approach it, and maybe this is the fact that for them, these are kind of like breakout roles, and they approach them like regular characters. And I think they do elevate the material, especially with Reeve, who has the opportunity to turn Clark Kent into this, he plays him as this bumbling kind of doofus, but there's an awareness there and there's a purpose, and it works in a way that Hackman doesn't.
You think Margot Kidder felt she was above this material coming out of Black Christmas in 1974? I don't think so. She tackled this movie like a serious job. So did Reeves. And they delivered. And I think thanks to that chemistry, thanks to those performances, we have a Superman now. We have comic book movies now. Because if you had gotten, I hate to put him on the spot because we'll never know, but I don't think Dustin Hoffman would have cared. I think an old Paul Newman would have shown up and been like, nah, I'm not doing this.
Yeah, I think all of these movies live and die by the Lois and Clark relationship. The romance kind of is the heart of all of them.
Yeah,
that's a really good point. I very much agree with that. I think depending on how the two actors in any given Superman movie, depending on their chemistry and depending on how the movie focuses on the romance, that's really the direction where these movies go ultimately.
Yep. I agree.
Well, beyond those performances, it's still an extremely ambitious film. You start watching this and you realize that it very clearly was meant to be one massive 4.5 hour long movie that gets awkwardly chopped in the middle. The pacing here doesn't quite work all the way once you get to the second half of the film. And I do wonder what would have happened if Richard Donner was given the opportunity to make one 3.5 hour long movie instead of like having two 2 hour long films, which is more or less, I think, the running time of what ends up getting out to theaters, because it really takes its time developing the characters. We spent a long time in Smallville, for example, looking at like Superman's early days. We really don't get to see Superman as such until 48 minutes into the movie. Guys, that's crazy. 48 minutes into a movie called Superman, we don't get to see the Superman. Right?
It's expensive.
Yeah, it's expensive to have him on, but wait until even longer to see him fly. That's what you came to the movie for. You wait, I timed this out, 68 minutes until Superman flies in the movie. Guys, that's nearly halfway through the running time, where the number one thing that you paid a ticket to go see, You'll Believe a Man Can Fly, you have to sit through this movie up until that point to see it. And I think that's to its strength. I think the first half of the movie basically plans this really well drawn out, character driven film, setting driven film, where Smallville, I think, is fleshed out, where I think Metropolis is fleshed out. It works to its benefit. The problem in this movie is that after around the 90-95 minute mark, I think that's when they run out of money and they're like, all right, listen, we got to wrap this up. And then there's just a really, really quick montage of Superman doing Superman things. And then we go into a very awkward, tacked on ending that, frankly, I don't think works.
These movies have been up and down for me. The first time I watched it, I was like, what? Why? And as I got older, I got to appreciate them more, and knowing more about the amount of work that went into them and how much they set the landscape for everything to come. I really appreciate these first two movies. And there's a lot that I love so much about them, the Lois and Clark relationship. But the things that I hate so much that it makes it so hard for me to enjoy them.
Russ, on your end, we know you probably liked this as a kid, like we all did. As an adult, what's your relationship been like with these movies? Because you probably see them with the same nostalgia that we see them with. But watching them from a critical perspective, do they still hold up?
The first movie mostly does. I mean, I think you've pegged all of the issues that I have with the first movie, especially beyond the stuff that I mentioned with casting, the breakdown in pace towards the end of the movie, and where it becomes very clear that they didn't really have an ending. I think even as a kid, the flying backwards around the Earth to reverse time was kind of like, oh, guys, come on, really? And then what's even more galling is that if you watch the Richard Donner cut of Superman 2, then they use it again. And it's like, okay, clearly this is where that was
the original ending, right? Because they planned that to be the original ending of the two.
Yes.
When they run out of money, they're like, all right, we can't cliffhanger this.
Exactly.
Let's do we might not even get to make the second one, especially Donner at that point.
And so it's like the Donner thing at least doesn't have the amnesia kiss that's in the original cut of Superman 2. But then the amnesia kiss shows up again in Superman 4. And
very problematic.
Yeah. And there's just a bunch of stuff here where they got so much right. And I mean, really, again, you can't overemphasize the value of Reeve and Kidder and what they do, especially in this first movie. And it's like so much for the next 4 movies is rooted in that, even with Kidder basically bowing out of 3.
And Hackman as well, right? I mean, he kind of balked. I think the producers realize how much money they have to pay Marlon Brando anytime they use his face or voice.
Yeah, totally.
They're like, nah, we're good. Thank you. This is a movie that a lot doesn't work, but what does work is Kidder, Reeves, Donner, and John Williams, the composer, and that John Williams score. And honestly, if you can hit your romantic lead, your director, and your composer, you're probably going to have a good movie most of the time. Everything else cannot be perfect, but you got those 4 ingredients right in most movies, even without an ending. And I think you can pull it off. Superman 1978 is not a perfect movie. I think it is half of a perfect movie. And I think the other half is a business decision. And I think that's unfortunate. But those 4 elements elevate it to this iconic status that we know of superhero movies today.
Yes.
Yeah, give a big shout out to the art department on that too for bringing Krypton and everything to life. I think that huge heavy lifting at the beginning of the movie.
Yeah, and they created some really striking images there. I think deciding what Krypton looks like is a consistent difficulty. You know, watching the Zack Snyder movie, I was like, I don't know, man, this looks like kind of like Dune crossed with an Apple store made out of rocks. I don't know. But yeah, so I agree. Like there was some really great, and some of it is really simple, you know, you can tell that there's some budget at play. Like, how do we make Krypton without spending the entire budget of the movie making Krypton? And they do a nice job in Superman the movie. It's really good.
Unfortunately, Superman 2 has big production difficulties that come about after Richard Donner has a falling out with the producers of the series, the Salkins. Donner is fired, replaced by Richard Lester, who has a much more comic, lighthearted, and slapstick approach to things. The end result is you have reportedly around 80% of the film already shot by one director, the guy that made The Omen. And then the guy that made the Beatles movies comes in and says, like, I want full credit for this. I'm going to reshoot it. The end result, I think, is a Superman 2 where it is very obvious the parts that work are the parts that were kept from Richard Donner, and a spirited but failed effort from a very, very, very misplaced Richard Lester in this film. I know there's a lot of fan heat around this. We hadn't really seen the full Donner cut, if you will, until, what was it, the late 2000s when we got a
2006. Yeah,
around the release of Superman Returns, right? So we didn't really get to see that realized. Having seen that Richard Donner cut for the first time, what I can confirm to you is it still sucks.
Yes.
There's no good version of Superman 2.
No,
they both suck. Yep. So, yeah, I mean, I am going to criticize Lester, but I am not going to leave Donner off the hook. I don't think there was ever going to be a good version of this. And again, it feels like 40 minutes of a great movie stretched out to 120. Going back to the whole thing, hey, couldn't we have had one really good 3.5 hour long movie that combines the best elements of Superman 2 and Superman 1? I think there's an in-between cut there that was never made. And just the 2-film concept, which was the only reason this got made, really, I think works at a disservice to this. You lose one director in the second half. Hackman says, you know what? I'm not coming back for reshoots. I don't like this new guy. Yeah. No one's really happy. You have even less money the second time out than you had the first one. Outside of that Metropolis fight scene at the end, I'm not sure any of this works. Diogo, correct me. What does work here?
I think the same things work from the first movie. I think it's Clark and Lois and it's Richard Donner. And I think the Richard Donner parts are still better than the Lester parts. You can see in the director's cut, there's his sequences of how Lois digs into Clark, I feel like work a lot better. Her jumping out of the window rather than the Niagara Falls.
Yeah.
Her getting lost in the river. I feel like if we got to see a full Donner version of it, it would have been better. I don't think we would have gotten the tearaway Superman shield being thrown, the like multiple Superman, the fortress hijinks. That I'm like, I don't know where these powers keep coming from. Why does this keep happening to me?
Hey, just wait until Superman 4 when he like uses his eye beams to rebuild the Great Wall of China.
Oh yeah, the masonry vision. Yeah, that was impressive.
Yeah.
I didn't know it was a power, apparently. Superman 2 getting released in 1981, 3 years after the release of the original 1978 Superman. They make some tweaks for the sequel. The sequel ends up placing third in the list of the year's top 10 movies in 1981. But I think it's obvious to anyone that's seen both movies that the franchise has lost a step. And just getting these two movies out into theaters and making the money you've already made is a win already. Also, if you look at the other movies that performed well at the box office in both those years, you look at something like Superman in 78, coming a year after Star Wars, and it feels like Superman is part of what big movies are going to look like in the future with the release of the first one. But by the time you get to 1981, by far the top movie of the year is Raiders of the Lost Ark. And you compare something like Raiders of the Lost Ark to Superman 2,
Yeah.
and you realize that the blockbuster of the 80s is not going to look like these Superman movies at all.
No. Well, I mean, the blockbuster of the 80s is studio backed with far more resources than, the Salkins are bringing to bear here. And they're not being made without drama. Certainly Raiders was made with as much drama. And in many ways, Raiders was very seat of the pants. But there's a big difference between Steven Spielberg at that era and virtually anyone else. So yeah, Superman 2 is really struggling, and it really, Superman 2 feels even more patched together, as you said, than the first movie, which already felt kind of patched together. And this one, I think it's obvious to any adult viewer that it's like, oh, this is, they're lucky to get this one out into theaters with an ending, much less something that's good.
So now let's go to where this thing starts falling apart. Only 2 years later, with the 1983 release of Superman 3, a film that does not even break into the top 10 highest grossing movies of the year, after the first two were respectively the number 2 and number 3 top grossers. By number 3, Richard Lester has complete creative control in making the movie he wants. And boy, is that movie awful. Because we have a tragically miscast Richard Pryor in a movie that very much feels like Richard Pryor does not want to be in, and that Richard Lester kind of doesn't want to make a Superman movie. It seems like Richard Lester wants to make a Richard Pryor comedy, and that's news to everybody involved in this film.
Now, here's the thing I'm going to say about Superman 3. Superman 3 is, if you, as I was, if you were a kid, if you were 10 years old and went to a flea market and bought a giant box of comic books in the early 80s and just grabbed a random Silver Age Superman issue out of that box of comic books and read it, something from the 60s, early 70s, this movie very much approximates what those comic books felt like. It's insane and goofy and occasionally inspired in the same way that those stories were. And so I have a fondness, and I think I'm more forgiving towards Superman 3, starting out from the premise that this does not work as a Superman movie, and it doesn't really work as a movie at all. And yet I find it very funny. Christopher Reeve gets to make consistently wonderful faces throughout. Like, evil Superman is hilarious to me. It's very funny. And just him kind of smirking and being a jerk, flicking peanuts to break liquor bottles in a bar is funny.
There's one thing in this movie that I really like, and it is Annette O'Toole's Lana Lang.
She's great. She's legitimately good.
For our Smallville fans out there that love seeing Martha Kent younger, deeper in the Superman universe, it is just amazing seeing her there. And the rest of the movie, I'm pulling my hair out, because the Salkins even said that their original plan for the movie was to make Brainiac and Mr. Mxyzptlk and bring in Supergirl and have Superman and Supergirl not know they were cousins and be attracted to each other. that got shut down.
It's a total mess. I utterly get why anybody would hate it. I don't hate it. I think it's funny. I don't even feel bad about thinking it's funny, but I don't expect anyone else to think it's funny.
Yeah, they lost me from the opening. The first scene, that is that Mr. Magoo sketch that runs very long, the slapstick setup.
It feels like Richard Lester trying to do a Jacques Tati thing. Like
Yeah,
it feels
that's a
like the
great shout.
movie Playtime or something,
Yeah.
but transported to Metropolis, which again, like Playtime was one of my all-time favorite movies. I revere Jacques Tati. I think he's amazing. So seeing Richard Lester attempt to do what feels to me very much like a Jacques Tati thing, again, it kind of works for me, and I understand. And even though I think the whole sequence does not work, the concept works for me, and I also fully understand why it would annoy everyone else.
Yeah, the movie doesn't work at all. The movie doesn't work at the box office either, and that puts the Salkins in a really tricky spot because the next movie they've got coming up with these rights is going to be a make or break for them. And I'm talking about 1984 Supergirl. They end up putting together a team that feels ambitious still. It still feels like a big event movie, but maybe one rung below that ambition of 1978. So instead of getting Richard Donner coming out of The Omen, or the guy, Richard Lester, as misplaced as he is, he's still a legendary director, making two of probably the best known music films of all time. Instead of that, you get the guy that made Jaws 2 to come in and direct Supergirl.
To be fair, he had also directed Christopher Reeve in his post-Superman movie Somewhere in Time. So it's like there's a little, a deeper connection there.
Yeah.
He does go on to direct a lot of episodes of Smallville.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't know that. He directed Smallville episodes as well?
A whole bunch of them, yeah. A lot of good episodes of Smallville.
Oh, look at that. So his ties to this series are obviously there, but Supergirl does not work. Now, I have to tell our listeners, I could not be bothered. I don't get paid enough. I had already seen Superman 3 and Superman 4, and I will unfortunately go to my grave without knowing if Supergirl is a good movie or not. So, Russ, take it away. Is it?
No, it's not a good movie. It's a mess. It's like way more comic book sci-fi than any of the Superman movies to date. And it's got, they just kind of it feels like they're bending over backwards to both explain how this character survived Krypton, to make it part of something that could be Superman-ish. Like, Jimmy Olsen, played by Mark McClure from the Superman movies, is in this. Like, that's the tie, really. But like, it begins in Argo City, which is a chunk of Krypton that survived the explosion of the planet. And this place kind of looks like a community theater production of The Dark Crystal. Like, it just...
Oh, man, that is brutal. That's the worst pull quote of all time.
It just... From the beginning, it's like, what am I looking at? What is happening here? And it's just like... Yeah. It's disorienting, and then it never... Like, it feels like an alternate universe episode of a TV series that would have been on Fox in 1992. It just, it's, and like, Helen Slater, bless her, doesn't really work. She's got fabulous hair. Oh my God, her hair. When she's a Supergirl.
Absolutely stunning hair.
Just, good Lord, the hair is incredible. And the hair is doing a lot of the heavy lifting.
Hairdressing will continue to have a major part in this franchise in the years after this, by the way.
Absolutely. But yeah, Diogo, I would love to hear your thoughts. I don't really have much more than that.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a repeat of the same problems and just a general disrespect for the characters. I think Helen Slater, I like her in this. And after watching this, I had a moment where I was like, I have to see her in something else that isn't Superman related.
Yes.
So I put on The Legend of Billie Jean.
That's the other big movie of the era with Helen Slater, yeah.
Which I thought was like an actually good coming-of-age tale for a young girl that was like a better fit for her as Supergirl than the actual Supergirl movie. Because of all these Superman movies, I think Supergirl made the absolute least amount of sense. It was a story that I couldn't follow at all.
Yeah.
It was bumbling villains who were witches, sorcerers who like didn't know how to do magic, but were still going up against Supergirl, a Supergirl who lands on Earth and decides, I'm going to go to high school. And
because that's the first thing you do. You're like, you know what? I'm going to be 16 again. Because that was the best time in my life.
She took a nap in the woods, woke up when she saw softball, and she's like, I'm going to go hang out with them forever. I was like, what? Weren't you supposed to find the magic orb that fixes your city that's floating in space-time?
Algebra 2. Like, we got Algebra 2 at 9.
She doesn't understand the magic orb any better than the audience did. Yeah. So I understand it. And, maybe the softball looked like a magic orb to her.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a mess. It's impenetrable. It's awkward. Yeah, there's very little to recommend here, sadly.
And we have to bring this up at this point because this is the Salkinds' last hurrah with these rights. And they worked so hard. They really were tireless in bringing this to the feature screen. Without them, none of this happens, period. It's their insistence and persistence in making these movies what puts them on the map. But by this point, it's obvious that they're not producing movies for the audience of this time. They're maybe making movies, kind of like The Three Musketeers, for a late 70s crowd looking for either an elevated B movie or a big budget draw in that era. 1984, you look at the movies that were the highest grossing domestically, you got titles like Beverly Hills Cop, Ghostbusters, Indiana Jones Temple of Doom, Gremlins, Karate Kid, Footloose, Splash. That's what audiences are looking for. Supergirl is nowhere near what those movies are, at least definitely not tonally, at least definitely not in what its ambitions are as a movie. So after this go around, the Salkinds sell the rights on to anyone that'll take them, basically to keep on this series going. And that's when probably the worst company that could have come in and bought this IP steps in with a bag full of cash. And I say this very appreciatingly of all of the support that Canon Films gave this publication in the 1980s. Without the support of Canon Films in the 80s, I'm not sure there's a box office magazine today. They were very friendly to exhibitors because in this nascent home video era marketplace, they came in with genre counter programmers, done on the cheap, done quickly, designed to make a little bit more money than they should at the box office.
As someone who was a very avid moviegoer at that point, I certainly understood the Canon logo to represent a number of things, which, typically meant satisfying, entertaining, but maybe not very stimulating, intellectually stimulating action. I was a big
get
fan.
The job done, basically. It was like the Spirit Airlines of movie studios.
Totally. I mean, hey, look, I was in 7th and 8th grade. I loved Missing in Action. I loved American Ninja. When Bloodsport came out when I was in high school, I saw Bloodsport 20 times.
That is a great film. We don't mess around with Bloodsport. Mm-hmm. Bloodsport is a great film.
Absolutely. It's like they were, all of the stuff that was in there. It's like, I really liked a bunch of that. I saw Cobra in theaters. I saw Cobra with my mom, and we were both
Cobra, also a great film. We will
both
not
like, that movie rips. Like, this is great. Also, at the time I had cable. And so I enjoyed some of Canon's other outings, which maybe had, let's say, a lower costume budget, because a lot of the people in those movies wore fewer clothes than in, Missing in Action. And I was okay with that, too. So
at the time, we have to clarify this. Canon's first foray into the American market was remaking cheap softcore movies for a slightly wider audience in the US. So it had just enough hints of sleaziness to maybe titillate a certain type of viewer, but it wasn't all out pornography. It was, it wasn't unrelated to it. Wink.
I think if it could have been more pornographic, it would have been. But
Yes.
you know, these movies were actually released in theaters, and you know, ultimately then became part of the burgeoning home video market. You know, I think Canon was one of those companies that really was helped along by the advent of VHS, certainly. But then you get to Superman 4, and they, you know, Golan and Globus are able to buy the rights to Superman. And they, honestly, I don't even know that much about the production of this. I know that Christopher Reeve kind of pitched the nuclear disarmament story. And whenever you get to the point in your superhero franchise where you're doing this sort of didactic, ripped from the headlines kind of storyline, however well intentioned it might be, you're in a danger zone. And this movie dives all the way into the danger zone headfirst and just does not recover.
No. They get Reeves back, they get Hackman back, they get Kidder back, with great promises of a real budget and a way to finish what they started. And then they promptly slash that budget into pieces and go with the cheapest and quickest solution. The film is trimmed down to a minuscule running time by the time it hits theaters, and just fails upon takeoff in the 1987 box office. I want to hear what Diogo thinks about this movie. I have nothing of value to say about this. I saw all of these, by the way, all of 1978 through 87 movies, 1 through 4, on taped from TV copies that my dad put together on Betamax.
Wow.
So I have a huge fondness for these movies. As I rewatch them, I had flashbacks to watching them in like my childhood home in Querétaro in Mexico, sitting on my parents' like bed and watching them on TV. So I have this great nostalgia for these movies, but that's probably the only positive thing I can say about definitely 3 and 4, certainly 4. What seemed odd to me at the time, watching these movies in the early 90s on Betamax, is that my dad recorded 3 sets of movies from American television on Betamax, which were the 3 movies that I grew up watching in my childhood. The Rocky movies, which I mentioned this all the time on this podcast, the Karate Kid movies, which is basically Rocky Jr., and the Superman movies. And of all of those, the Superman movies are probably the ones I think about the least. But I grew up with these movies, and sometimes I will confuse certain aspects or shots from, let's say, a Karate Kid movie or a Rocky movie with a Superman movie because of this. So you can imagine my confusion when Amazon Basics Dolph Lundgren shows up in Rocky 4 as the villain. Store brand Ivan Drago is a terrible fit for Superman, but the idea is kind of cool. And I'm not going to lie to you, maybe 6-year-old me was willing to go with it more than I think I would have at any other age. Diogo, did this or not work in any way for you?
This movie, the first note that I wrote about rewatching it this time was screaming at TV.
Yeah.
It's just, I just lost my mind. It's just more of the same, disrespecting the characters. The magic kiss that implies that Superman just takes Lois around for a joyride whenever he wants and wipes her memory after is just unthinkable for me.
She's like his unpaid therapist in a weird way, you know?
Yeah. And he sneaks a kiss in there whenever he wants. I'm like, no, absolutely not. And him running around, humiliating the trainer at the gym. He does these there's so many little petty things that he does that we see in the Lester movie too, in Superman 2, where he just walks out in front of a cab and the cab hits him. And he breaks the car.
Or there's like the diner thing in Superman 2.
Yeah.
I actually want to, in a minute, I want to say something more about that. This movie, Margot Kidder looks, in every scene, Margot Kidder looks like she regrets saying yes. She looks genuinely upset to be in this movie, and like
Yeah.
she looks tired. And I get it. I'm watching the movie and I'm tired. And this is not a knock against Margot Kidder. This is sympathy. But like this movie repeats, like you say, repeats the amnesia kiss. It repeats, the beautiful, like what was wonderful in the first Superman movie where Superman takes Lois Lane on this, night fly is wonderful in that film. And then they do it again here because there are just not very many ideas.
Well, they even repeat her going to Paris.
Yes.
Like it's even the same country that she's going to.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense.
So weird.
Yeah, it's really bizarre. And then it's like, okay, you're a Francophile, fine, I guess. Yeah. But then, like, I do really like Nuclear Man's manicure. His nails look great.
Oh yeah.
I don't know why he has 3-inch, silver claw nails, but the diva that Nuclear Man is, just they're beautiful. Yeah, the Nuclear Man idea is not the worst. Oh my God. Also, Superman collects every nuclear missile on Earth and carries them in a giant space net, which he then hurdles around like a giant slingshot. And come on, that is hilarious. That is an amazing.
Now I'm seeing the elements that Gene Hackman drew from in his performance in Unforgiven.
Yes,
I think after this, he's like, you know what, guys, I made a movie just like this.
That's right, exactly. Yeah, no, there are one or two things in this movie where I'm genuinely entertained, and most of it is just like, I'm on fast forward.
Yeah, no. Superman fighting an 80s pro wrestler does not work for me, and I say that as a massive pro wrestling fan.
Yeah.
Yeah, you would think this would be high on your list, Diogo, but it's on nobody's list, if anything.
But then he defeats him with an elevator?
Yeah.
Or kind of partially defeats him with an elevator. Like, that's, okay. Almost inspired. Almost.
Yeah. A repeat of fighting on the moon, a repeat of throwing bombs into space and villains come back.
Yes. There are no new ideas in this movie.
It also ends up putting Superman on ice as a feature film property. After this, no one's touching Superman, which is odd to say because it's 1987. Only a couple of years after this movie. Yeah. Only 2 years after this movie, we've got Tim Burton's Batman. But that's also telling in that only 2 years separate the end of this Christopher Reeve, Margot Kidder era of the superhero movie. And it gets replaced with something that could not look more different. It's not a daytime movie. It's a nighttime movie. It's not Christopher Reeve. It's Michael Keaton. It's something so completely different that reinvents the superhero movie that you don't see how you can ever go back to making a Superman movie in this climate. And for many years, they just don't. Superman ends up being a TV property for a while. You've got some animated series. Obviously, the television show, The Adventures of Lois and Clark, comes out in 1992, 93. And the property keeps on being alive through that. Superman as a pop culture icon and as a symbol is also going through some hard times to the point where DC Comics in the early 90s, I believe, decides to kill off the character. Guys, you're both comic book people. Can you let me know what the reason was on why DC Comics would get its biggest character and bring in a story arc like this? Because post Superman 4, it seems like Superman isn't working on any medium at all.
This was not an uncommon sales tactic. It's like comic books starting in the late 80s and then really accelerating into the 90s started to lean heavily on these kind of big event storylines. You saw the death of Robin was probably, you had something like Crisis on Infinite Earths and Secret Wars from Marvel, which were both early to mid 80s series that crossed over into multiple things and that sort of really kicked off the modern age of these giant crossover storylines. But then you also got stuff in the late 80s like The Death of Robin, where, they built this 3-issue arc in Batman, and then you could call in and vote on whether or not Robin should live or die. And they were going to publish, whichever issue more people voted for. You get like Superman getting married, you get Spider-Man getting married, all these things. They do these events. And then you get Doomsday showing up, and you get, the death of Superman. And it's a pretty blatant kind of, can we revitalize this character? Can we juice sales a little bit higher kind of sales tactic? And there's, frankly, there's probably much deeper things, and all these probably have deeper roots in, the editorial bullpens of their respective publishers, people pitching these stories like, hey, I got a great idea to kill Superman. Let's do it. But for me, the death of Superman story in 92 and 93 feels more crass than most.
At the time in the 90s, Superman was also going through a weird time finding himself again, because the comic books were leaning heavily towards anti-heroes and dark, gritty characters. DC had the big blue Boy Scout character in the middle of this dark, gritty world, and he pretty much just got a mullet. That was his new edge. So
edgy Superman is a haircut.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this was a time for DC to also do something new and revitalize the character. So they figured, let's kill him.
Whether that story arc works or not, it's still a major story arc. It's one that when you hear about it, when you read of it, it sounds like a movie. And it's interesting that it's never really been properly done as a movie. People have tried. We've had versions of it kind of show up in some movies. But that really dominates, I think, a lot of the narrative around this character in the 1990s. The release of TV show, The Adventures of Lois and Clark, the death of Superman storyline. But the movie theater superheroes in the 90s, it's basically Batman or bust. Warner Brothers is in the Batman business at this point. They're trying to see how they can crack a Superman movie, and it's not really taking off. And honestly, I think another big factor in this, even though he probably aged out of the role by this point, is the tragic accident suffered by Christopher Reeve in 1995 that leaves him paralyzed. I think maybe in a minor way, having an actor that at this point you so closely relate to a feature film adaptation of a character, I do think that made it harder for a movie about Superman coming out at all in the 1990s. It's sort of a lost decade here in this series.
It's interesting that you're talking about Batman as envisioned by Tim Burton, sort of dominating the 90s. But Tim Burton spent a lot of time working on a Superman movie in the mid-90s. Like you said earlier, there may be more failed Superman projects than there are released movies. And Tim Burton's Superman Lives is the one that famously might have featured Nicolas Cage, became the thing that it's like, that was one that got further than most.
Yeah. And that would have taken the death of Superman storyline, put it up, fully realized under Tim Burton. There's a great documentary on this from 2015 called The Death of Superman Lives that I highly recommend. Got great access to some of the producers involved in the series, including Tim Burton. We were maybe a couple of production meetings away from this movie getting made. Knowing what I know about this movie now, and knowing what we all know about special effects work in the late 90s, I think this was too ambitious to have stood the test of time. I think of Superman Lives, and I keep on thinking back to something like Spawn, like the big screen adaptation of Spawn, made around the same time. I think it would have looked very similar to that, with special effect works that just wasn't quite there. And we ended up with a movie that was underwhelming in that regard.
Yeah, that documentary about it was so interesting. And I personally feel that this would have been it wouldn't have stood the test of the opening weekend. I think it would have bombed immediately. I think people wouldn't have recognized
1999, you don't think audiences
I
would
don't
have
think
come out?
people.
The Summer of Wild Wild West, you don't think this comes out?
It's the same villain, giant spider, same producer. But yeah, I just feel like there was just such a huge disrespect for the character, and that was the main thing that I got from the documentary was how many people did not like Superman who were making a Superman movie.
Kind of happens a lot, though, no?
Yeah, it does. You see John Peters just being like, I don't want to see him fly. I don't want to see him in that suit. And he has to fight a giant spider. It's like, that's a different movie. That's a different thing.
Yeah.
You sure you want to make a Superman movie? Yeah.
And Tim Burton always saying like he's never read a comic book before too. I'm like, yeah, it shows. So, the Batman movies worked because Batman's a character, I think, who works for his style.
Yeah.
I think Superman is the antithesis of everything. And I think we get a sample of that in Batman versus Superman, where you see Superman at his exact opposite and how it doesn't work.
Yeah. I think that's interesting. Russ, do you think the Tim Burton Superman Lives would have worked in any iteration of this industry in the late 90s?
No, I don't think it would have. And that's kind of why I'm sad it didn't happen, because from my perspective, I would always rather spend a bunch of studio money to make a kooky ass movie.
Don't get me wrong.
Safe. So, I mean, would it have worked? Probably, almost certainly not. Now, do I wish I could have seen it? Absolutely.
Oh yeah, I'd love to see a Nick Cage, Sandra Bullock Superman movie.
Yeah.
That sounds insane.
Yeah, it does. And so that, from that perspective, yeah, I'm sad it didn't ever happen. Instead, we ultimately get something very different.
Well, before we even get to that something very different, there were two other projects that also had a stop and start basis. We had another Batman. The first Batman versus Superman pitch was attached with, I believe it was Josh Hartnett being rumored for the lead. Wolfgang Peterson is director for sure. I forget who he was going to be opposite with. You remember, Diogo?
I don't remember.
Johnny Depp, if I'm not mistaken. I think Johnny Depp was the name that they were floating around for Batman. I'm not sure.
Oh, is that the Asylum, the Batman versus Superman Asylum movie?
There was a concept there that they'd been working on for a while. Never got off the ground. Batman vs. Superman was a concept that had been kicked around to reintroduce the character. It never happened. It didn't happen. Got a little bit closer was Superman Flyby that had a couple of directors attached to that. You definitely had McGee coming off Charlie's Angels attached to making that. And then you also had J.J. Abrams for a little bit talking to get involved in that film. Ultimately, neither of those directors signed on to it. And that project, Superman Flyby, ends up evolving into what we know as Superman Returns, released in 2006 and directed by Bryan Singer, who in his own right reimagined and reinvented the superhero genre with his adaptation of X-Men. He comes in and tackles a Superman sequel that is directly tied to the Donner films, that retcons and erases the last two Superman outings, Superman 3 and Superman 4. And ultimately a film that I find to be way too respectful of the Donner movies and ultimately incredibly boring. I saw this with Diogo, by the way. We saw it at the AMC Sunset Place 24, Miami, Florida. I remember the day perfectly.
Yep. I remember seeing it with you then, and I remember driving up to Fort Lauderdale to see it in the IMAX there as well, because that was the only IMAX in the area, an hour away.
Russ, where did you see it? What did you think of it?
2006, I would have seen it in Atlanta. I saw a press screening. Unless I saw it at Comic-Con, I don't remember. Then, as now, there are elements of it that I like. Okay. I like Kevin Spacey as Lex Luthor. I still don't know if I love the writing of this screen version of Lex, but I do really like what Spacey does with it. And Spacey, not my favorite actor, but I think he really works for what's going on here. I like Brandon Routh as Superman. He's kind of too young to play this Superman that had already been established for a few years and who left for 5 years and then came back. Both he and Kate Bosworth feel a little too young, but I think they both bring a degree of commitment to it that I appreciate and that I think ultimately helps carry them over that hump. But I agree with you. It's like, it's too respectful. It has really standout moments that I think work beautifully well, but then it has a lot of, it's just like, it's being very serious about it all. It's too long. Like, man, cut at least 30 minutes out of this movie, please. And it just, in the end, I kind of feel like, can we just get to the good stuff? It's, it doesn't really, it's not riveting, put it that way.
No, the good stuff never comes. Basically what happens here, if you're following the story, Superman at this point has defeated Lex Luthor, turned back time, defeated aliens from the Phantom Zone, teamed up with Richard Pryor to fight a supercomputer and his evil twin. He's also eradicated nuclear weapons from the world. Then he gets his girlfriend pregnant and leaves for 5 years and comes back as deadbeat dad Superman to find out there's internet now.
Also, this movie is released and set in 2006. He's been gone for 5 years. Nothing big happened in that interim. You got to wonder how seriously they ever considered addressing 9/11 in this movie, because this does feel like a very post 9/11 movie. It's like, it's inescapable. I mean, the first major Superman set piece is with a crashing plane. There's so much stuff in this film that's like, okay, yeah, we're really skirting around this big issue, which is that Superman left just before 9/11. And it's like, it's kind of difficult to really approach this. Like, does the world still need Superman, when it's like, oh yeah, he probably would have stopped 9/11. There's a gaping thematic emptiness in this movie as a result that I think it never is able to resolve. And it's a big problem for the film.
It's telling that the character isn't reintroduced in a straight up reboot, as was suggested a couple of times when some of these failed iterations of Superman, for two reasons. One, the Donner Superman is such a blueprint, and can you really go toe to toe in remaking that? Is it going to be any better?
Yeah.
That's the first question. And the second is, at this point, we've kind of seen the superhero origin story a bunch now. You had X-Men, you had Spider-Man, you had a number of MCU titles that had already trickled into release. We kind of don't want to see that anymore. The novelty of reintroducing a superhero origin story was kind of done. So I understand why you come in with a distant sequel, right? Or a revised sequel. Ultimately, it doesn't really work. I think a villain would have gone a long way here, honestly. Yeah. I think if there's someone for Superman to punch or fight, it's interesting. But Superman versus an existential question about his use in today's society, that's not compelling for me to go see over a hot summer day at a multiplex. Although I had a great time at the AMC Sunset Place 24 with you, Diogo.
Yeah.
Good afternoon.
I feel that. No, this is a movie that I in general like. I like it. I'm cool watching it. It's kind of like the first Superman for me, where I'm like, yeah, I like this. I can enjoy it. But it just got so bogged down in nostalgia that they forgot to actually make something happen. Watching Superman fight missiles again, watching him just like stop buildings and fighting earthquakes. We've been down that road before, and they simultaneously didn't want to tell his origin story again and told his origin story again.
Yes.
Yeah. All the same times. They were like, what if, to bring Superman to new modern audiences, what if we just didn't do that at all?
Right.
Well, and that's another part. I mean, Russ brings up the challenge of 9/11 and how do you work in a character like Superman in a post 9/11 world. Even in fighting like earthquakes, guys, this is maybe a year removed from Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like in terms of like a cultural weight, it's not relevant. And I think that's what hurts this movie. It tries to ask this big philosophical question, but fails to take that question seriously in its application in the real world.
There's a couple of things. The closer Superman movies get to reality, quote unquote, I think the more they struggle, because the character necessarily has to be, I think, a little bit more fantastical on screen. And it's different. Like in comics, I think you can push them closer to reality and have it work because there's an interiority that is more easy, they're more able to depict in comics. Like that whole thing of Superman struggling with an existential question, I think works really well in comics. Alan Moore has written a really great story. And then there was the All-Star Superman that Morrison and Quitely did, which is phenomenal. And that does wrestle with a bunch of that, like Superman versus existential questions. And they're beautiful, beautiful stories that work on the page, much more difficult to do in real life. And I think that the closer you have Superman getting to something real, especially the closer you have him getting to like the military, which becomes an issue in Zack Snyder's movie for me, the harder it struggles, because it's like you start to see like the question is not so much does the world need a Superman, but can Superman possibly do everything that needs to be done? And it like pushes him more towards this godlike figure. And ultimately it's like, it's a tough place to go, because then it's like, well, if he's a god, why isn't he just fixing everything? Why doesn't he just do it all? And the answer is either, well, we don't want him to because we still need to retain human agency, or he can't, in which case he's an impotent god, in which case like that undermines the whole god thing in the, fundamentally. So there are big problems there that come up. And this movie pushes into that. You get like, over the years in comic books, the idea of what Superman's powers really mean has evolved since the last time there was a Superman movie. Like, does he hear everything that's going on Earth at once? And it's like, oh, maybe he does. And that's kind of put to interesting use in Superman Returns, where Superman's flying up above Earth and kind of like hanging out there quietly and listening to what's going on and trying to figure out where he needs to help. And it's like, I like that. That's kind of cool. But then the natural extension is like, okay, he seems to be everywhere, but he can't possibly literally help everyone. So then there are questions about like, well, why does he help the people he helps? I don't know. It gets tricky philosophically, and this wants to be a philosophical Superman movie, and there are unresolvable questions there. And it's like, man, I just want to see him punch a big alien or a machine.
That's
or
it.
something.
Just have him punch bad guys, man.
Yeah,
that's all you got to do.
So it gets tough.
Yeah.
That's all I'm saying is like, it gets harder. The more detailed you get with what he can do, the closer you get to like a really realistic portrayal of the character, the harder it is.
Yeah. Completely.
Yeah. Tom Mankiewicz, the creative consultant on the first Superman movies, told Christopher Reeves when he was putting the story together for Superman 4, don't focus on anything that Superman can cure. Just stay away from that.
Yes.
And he's like, right, got it. So I'll have him cure nuclear war. Let's do that.
Well, and the thing is, I mean, I kind of like, as much of a mess as Superman 4 is, I like the fact that the movie ends with Superman realizing that he can't do that. And that's the whole thing that I'm saying, where it's like, he can't do everything because humans have to retain agency. They've got to be able to make their own decisions and grow up on their own. And that's the end of Superman 4, where he's like, look, I want war to end, but I cannot end it for you. You have to end it yourself. And that's important. And I think that's that advice made manifest in the movie, seeing Superman try to do it and ultimately being unsuccessful. It's a big deal.
Yeah, I agree about the angst though. Like, watching Smallville for 10 years was watching him grow from teenage angst to existential angst. And it's all about, shaping him and who he's going to be. So I'm usually on boards for these stories.
There's room to do that in Smallville. There's not room to do that in a movie that also needs to dedicate 30 minutes to set pieces.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point. And it's interesting in how this movie never really gets past its potential, just because Smallville is able to do a lot of the things it wants to do better, I feel. Smallville is a TV show that was on screen from 2002 to 2011. And if you were to ask what's the defining Superman IP or product from that 2000s era, I think most people would say, forget Superman Returns. It's going to be Smallville.
It's Smallville.
It's never able to beat that show, ever.
Smallville's the defining Superman for me, period.
Superman Returns, often pitched as a disappointing box office performance, not really. The numbers are on par and a little bit better to the Nolan movie. Superman Returns opens to $52 million over the 4th of July weekend on a 3-day basis in 2006, ends up making $200 million domestic and $391 million worldwide. So yes, it's not $1 billion movie, but it's on par, if not a little better than what the Nolan movie does. The issue here is in the same way that you look at Superman 3 and Superman 4 and compare that to the blockbusters, to the tent poles that are happening around it in its release date, and you realize that this movie's out of place, out of time, and out of touch with those audiences. I think Superman Returns suffers from the same thing, because even though it performs comparatively to what Nolan does, I think the film's approach and execution leaves a lot to be desired, which impedes any sort of follow up to the movie happening at all. And I say this because after opening weekend, Superman Returns gets absolutely blown out of the box office in week 2 by Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Man's Chest, which ends up being one of the biggest movies of that year. You look at everything else that gets released in 2006 that makes more money. Mission Impossible 3 with J.J. Abrams, who leaves a Superman project to make that Mission Impossible movie, and I think effectively reinvigorates that Mission Impossible franchise. You had Casino Royale, which relaunches the James Bond franchise with a grittier, more down-to-earth look and tone. And then up the top, of course, you've got something like the Da Vinci Code, which makes $760 million worldwide. And the top movie of that year worldwide, not a Superman movie, Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Man's Chest, billion-dollar global earner. Superman Returns isn't that. And I think that's ultimately what derails the entire franchising of this Bryan Singer era for the series. But that narrative that it wasn't a box office hit, it's not the case. It did well. The thing is tonally, it wasn't like everything else that was coming out.
Yeah.
This isn't a Casino Royale. This isn't the Mission Impossible 3. I think that's what dooms it. Warner Brothers keeps on financing and supporting these Christopher Nolan Batman movies, and that's eventually the direction these Superman movies go into. And Nolan does, I think, play a pivotal role here, Russ, in establishing where this franchise will go. Because don't forget, Nolan wraps up The Dark Knight Rises and is named a producer to Man of Steel. And David S. Goyer, his co-writer on these Batman movies, ends up writing the script of Man of Steel. So Nolan's involved from the onset in crafting this first Superman movie, the 2013 release Man of Steel. They end up tapping Zack Snyder, at this point best known for his wonderful Dawn of the Dead remake, probably the best movie he will ever make. He also tried his hand on an ambitious but flawed Watchmen adaptation for the big screen. A compelling name, I think, to tackle Man of Steel. But for me, I think this is David S. Goyer's movie, man. I think there's a lot of the vibes of Nolan Batman, at least in this first part of what ends up becoming the DCEU. Russ, how did you feel about Man of Steel when you finally saw it in 2013?
Mixed, which is how I feel about it now. I think I really like Henry Cavill in the role. I think Henry Cavill makes a really great Superman. I like the idea of Michael Shannon as Zod, and I think that this movie makes Zod a fuller character than he was in Superman 2, where honestly, he's kind of not a character at all. He's just like a guy that says kneel before Zod. And it's like either you like that or you don't, but beyond that, it's just not really much of a thing. And I guess I appreciate the attempt to flesh it all out, but that attempt also makes this movie, to me, feel very ponderous. And again, you get that thing where this pushes Superman even closer into quote unquote reality. And for me, it's super awkward. And the thing as a whole doesn't work really well, despite the fact that I think there are individual parts that do work quite well.
Diogo, where did you see this movie? What did you think of it?
I saw this movie in San Francisco at the AMC Van Ness, and I loved it. And every time I've seen it since, I ended up loving it more. I think it's my favorite superhero movie.
It's interesting you say that. I rewatched it last night for, as I was preparing for this. It holds up really well for me, honestly. I think Michael Shannon as Zod is the first real villain that's worth talking about in any Superman movie. I think he's fantastic. When we talk about elevating the material, I think he does that. Does Michael Shannon want to be in Superman movies? Probably not. But he's great in this one, right? He delivers a great performance in something like this. I got to see parts of the Smallville origin story, or like a young Superman story, that I found were action-packed and interesting. That oil rig sequence, I think was great. Even little moments like when he's working at a diner in one of these flashbacks, or like a trucker's bar, I thought was compelling. I think this did a really good job with introducing the character as an alien, rather than as Superman. Because even in the Donner movie, when he shows up like 70 minutes into the running time, people are just like, oh, well, I guess that's real now.
Yeah.
We're good. We will accept this. But in
Yeah.
this one, there's a threat to Superman's existence. His mere existence is threatening. And then you have Zod and all of these other things show up. And this feels a lot more like a post 9/11 Superman movie, to the point where the final fight scene in Metropolis, I think, very strongly harkens back to some of that 9/11 footage.
Oh yeah, unquestionably, deliberately. But before we get to that, I do. So you talked about the diner scene where Clark, as a busboy or something, kind of tries to stop a manhandling jerko truck driver. Walks away from what could be a fight, but then ultimately, like, completely, like, impales the guy's truck on utility poles and stuff.
Yep.
And Diogo,
ruining his livelihood.
You had talked about the pettiness that we've seen from Superman in a couple of these movies, and I said I wanted to come back to it, and now we're coming back to it because I had this scene in mind. And there's a thing that I do think is kind of neat in all of these movies, and you see it in various ways, where it's like Clark is consistent, like it's very explicit text in Man of Steel. The question of like, how much are you going to show yourself? Like, how much are you going to put yourself out? How scared are people going to be of you? What do you have to do to be able to follow your impulse to be good and to use your powers responsibly, versus giving into your impulses and your urges. And I think we see that in these petty moments where Clark is like, man, as Clark, I just can't punch this guy's face off. But I do need to find a way to like he's not human, but he still gets angry. And it's like, what is he going to do? Go destroy a mountain, or is he going to destroy this guy's financial future? And it's like,
the truck's insured. Come on, he'll be fine.
Totally. Or hopefully he won't. He's a jerk. I don't know. Like, does he need to be fine? Maybe not. Maybe he needs to reevaluate his life. But anyway, these moments of pettiness, I do actually find really kind of work for me, because they do all play into that question of the character. And Man of Steel goes all in on that.
Yeah, it really worked for me in Man of Steel, particularly because it was still him figuring himself out. He doesn't know so much about himself, that he just goes and finds justice through absolute destruction there.
Well, and the fact that
way
if
overcorrecting.
you as a person discover that Superman exists, it's not cool. It's terrifying. You don't point out at the sky and say like, oh, look at that guy holding a helicopter. No, you go, oh my God, what's wrong with the universe, right? And I think this really settles in on that in a way that I found interesting and compelling. I think the action works here. I think the second half of the movie, which is basically 2 fight sequences, one in Smallville, I really like that one, and one in Metropolis, which I thought worked really well as well. They offered us a Superman movie that we hadn't seen before. And that's not something we can say since 1978, because Superman 2 is just the continuations of the first one. 3 and 4 are terrible. Returns is an homage. And by the time you get to this one, yes, it definitely feels like a Chris Nolan presents Zack Snyder Superman. Yes, I agree with that. But it also gives me a movie that I hadn't seen before in 3 decades of these movies existing.
Absolutely. I spent 10 years waiting for a man to change his clothes on Smallville, and we barely got that. So walking into this movie, and I was like, wait, hold on, he's already putting on the suit? Like, how is this happening? I just remember like tearing up so many times during this, watching him learn to fly, or with Pa Kent. It felt like there was a respect for this character, where like we saw his power set, we saw villains that had logic and weren't bumbling and were, you can actually get behind what they were saying, and everything seemed to be happening for a reason.
And this goes back into my, the difficulty with bringing it closer to reality, is like there was a point where we could just accept that Superman had an outfit that had a big S on the front of it, and that's all it had to be. And now we can't, as an audience, based on everything else that we've watched, it's harder to just accept that. But it's also difficult to explain it. And for me, the whole like, oh, the S is the family glyph and it means hope it's a lot for me. And I think it really works for some people. Diogo, maybe it really works for you. And I totally get it if it does. Yeah. I struggle with it a little bit. I'm kind of like, I don't know. It can just be his S on his shirt. It could just mean Superman, like it doesn't have to be the family crest. So yeah, that part, as we try to fully explain every design element, some of it I just don't need. It's like to me, it's a distraction.
Well, the film performed exceptionally well in theaters, opening to $116 million in mid-June 2013. Ends up grossing $291 million domestically and $670 million worldwide. It is the number 9 movie of the year in 2013. And for the first time in a long time, it doesn't feel out of place with contemporary blockbusters, with contemporary tentpoles, which would all indicate, after these great box office numbers, after this great creative vision coming into light, that there would be a sequel to this movie, fast-tracked, that would develop the Superman character and maybe give us more Superman villains. The answer is no. That did not happen. The answer is Warner Brothers is looking over at what Marvel is doing with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is sprinting towards an Avengers movie, and comes to the realization, hey, how can we do that in half the time, maybe a couple movies from now? And that is how we end up with 2016's Batman vs. Superman, Dawn of Justice, which frankly feels like 2 films. It feels like one film is Batman versus Superman, and another inferior film called Dawn of Justice, which is a Justice League prequel, kind of gets jammed in there in the corners and in the edges of the movie. And man, it does not work in any way, shape, or form. At least what we saw in theaters. The director's cut's significantly better, but still, it doesn't rescue a movie with a lot of problems. Now, Batman versus Superman as a concept had been around for a while. It seemed really cynical to me at the time. But Russ, you've mentioned this in the podcast before when we did our Batman episode. It's not that unheard of to have a comic book movie like this, right?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's certainly not unheard of for this sort of thing to happen in comics. I mean, this is like one of the cornerstone aspects of comic book storytelling. And so we've seen it a little bit less in movies, but it's not out, it's not totally out of the blue. But it is weird, I think this would be a lot less weird if there had already been a movie to set up this version of Batman.
Yeah.
Yes.
This became a Batman movie immediately.
It starts out as a Batman movie.
A quarter of a Batman movie, not even a fully realized Batman movie where Superman shows up at the end.
Right.
No, I absolutely agree.
So if there was already, and I like Affleck as Batman. I was into the idea from day one. Mm-hmm. I like a lot of the stuff about it. I'm so ready to see the good version of that. And I think maybe the closest we've come is the Snyder cut of Justice League, which gives him a little more room to maneuver. But this movie, this movie is trying to do like 4 different things, and I don't think it does any of them well. I think it's notable too, the idea of like Superman Returns being the last time we see Lex Luthor on the big screen before the rise of the tech bro. And so now Lex Luthor, by default, almost, it seems, is necessarily this massively empowered tech bro villain. And I kind of get it. And like, I kind of get casting Jesse Eisenberg in the role.
It was too on the nose, Russ. The guy that played Mark Zuckerberg.
It's
come on,
too on the nose.
So obvious.
I get it. Hey, look, Zack Snyder is kind of an on the nose guy. And I can accept that about him, but I don't think it works in this movie. I don't think this movie works at all. I think it has occasional glimmers of ideas, and most of it is a gigantic slog.
I think this movie, like Kevin Spacey, was sure a step up for me as Lex Luthor.
Mm-hmm.
He still bridged a little bit of that Gene Hackman, paying a little bit of respect, but in general, he like launched it way more into the direction that I was like, yes, okay, here we go. But I think that Batman versus Superman has an excellent Lex Luthor that is very comics accurate, and he is played by Ben Affleck and called Batman.
Yeah, that's actually
that's a good
it's
shout.
Insane.
That's a good point.
It's insane. Everything that Batman does in this movie is textbook Lex Luthor.
Yeah.
And Lex Luthor, we got Jesse Eisenberg there playing like the Joker or the Riddler, doing his thing. Why we messed up the names, y'all.
Yeah, I love Jesse Eisenberg as an actor. I think he's a great director too. But man, he does not work in this movie. He doesn't even like channel his Mark Zuckerberg performance. He channeled his Woody Allen stand-in performance. Seriously, this would have been a better role from Woody Allen to step in as Lex Luthor, as this neurotic, wiry, Lex guy.
It destroys me.
Yep.
And not only do they they try to do a lot that they don't come through on, but even the things I feel like they did right in Man of Steel, they completely abandoned. All of the work they did to set up Superman as this symbol of hope, of like building him up to like put him in the Daily Planet and like, okay, let's see him run as Clark now, like was just, we got one bathtub scene with him and Lois being close together, and then the rest of it was sad Superman starting off sad. He starts off as a controversial figure. He becomes sad the entire movie, and he ends up dead.
Yes.
So I was like, oh my God, where's my Superman? What happened?
Instead of launching a new DCEU, which that's the point of this movie, it kills the Superman character. It literally, and I think conceptually, as a character and as a franchise, we never get a Man of Steel 2 as part of the CEU. Superman as a character ends up getting relegated and pushed to the margins of the DCEU in all future movies. And I think a big part of it is this angry, angsty, growling Superman that we see through most of this movie. I like how the film starts, though. I do think there is, and I've said this before, there's a great movie somewhere in here. There are 3 or 4 scenes that are wonderful. I think the way the movie starts with a callback of the ending of Man of Steel and actually using that as like, hey, Superman is a threat. Let's explore this.
Yeah.
I think that works really, really well. But after 20 minutes, the movie stops trying to tell a story and starts trying to build a franchise. And it falls apart. There's not enough base there. There's no foundation of 2 or 3 or 4 films, the way Marvel had, by the way, to support all of these characters getting thrown in there. Why is Wonder Woman in there? No one knows. There's nothing to the story.
No.
Even having to continuously go back to Batman to remind people that Batman exists here and to develop his character, it feels like it's doing, like you mentioned, Russ, it's doing a lot of the lifting that a prior Batman movie would have done.
Yeah.
So it's an overlong, bloated mess of a movie with some really good action sequences. I think when Batman fights Superman, I think that looks cool. I think the Batmobile chase looks cool. I think the Batman warehouse sequence looks great. But everything outside of that, especially shoehorning the death of Superman with the Doomsday character for the last half hour. I remember watching this at the Regal LA Live. It was my first 4DX screening. That entire last half hour of the movie, I'm looking at my watch.
Yeah.
I'm just getting a back massage by the 4DX at that point. I couldn't wait to leave.
Yeah. And also, like you talking about shoehorning the death of Superman story in, but also shoehorning in like a weird pseudo adaptation of Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, know, and I like the idea of Affleck playing a version of that specific Batman. Like that idea is great. But, the whole Batman versus Superman thing really comes out of that book by Frank Miller. But it's done, notably when it happens in that issue of The Dark Knight Returns, like there's been a build up to it. There's been a whole thing. We're invested in that Batman character. And it's fundamentally a Batman story. It's not a Superman story. It's just, this is this is, I guess if I were being kind, I would call it ambitious. My gut is to call it misguided in the way that it is just trying to do too many things and can't concentrate on any of them. And as a result, they all fall apart.
Yeah. One of the core features of Superman is him seeing the best in people, him really like giving hope that way. And while we saw that through Man of Steel, that was the theme of it, of like, you have to take a leap of faith and trust people to make them trust you. We now see Superman being like, stop being Bat Vigilante. Stop it. You're bad. And I'm like, what? You don't want to ask the dude like why he's doing this, maybe? Like, do you think he's justified that his city's being destroyed? And no? Okay.
Well, you spend like 2.5 hours building this animosity, and it's resolved because they both have the same first name for their moms.
Oh,
that's how you resolve this grudge. Whoa, no way.
Which
Martha's mom's name? I am sorry about this.
Given all the work Batman, a detective, has done to get to this point in the movie, how did you not already know that? You know,
how does that even have that much weight? If I'm there with like a kryptonite spear about to kill Superman, an unkillable alien object that destroyed the city, and he just goes, "Bro, my mom's name is Martha," I'm like, okay. Stab. Like
protector of he's the protector of Gotham and everyone named Martha.
That's right.
That's ridiculous movie. Yeah. Again, there's a narrative here that the movie doesn't perform well at the box office. It kind of does.
It does well.
Yeah, it opens
People
to
showed up.
a fantastic opening weekend, 166 million. Now, what we will all talk about is that second weekend drop, right? 69% in week 2. But go back to Man of Steel. Man of Steel, second weekend drop, 64%. It's not that far off to what Batman versus Superman ended up performing like. Yeah. In fact, Man of Steel in its second weekend goes to number 3 in the box office, behind the debut of Monsters University and World War Z. At the very least, Batman v Superman keeps the top spot after week 1. So yes, there's the narrative that people rejected this movie after opening weekend. No, it had a steep drop. We've seen that happen again a number of times since. So I don't really buy that narrative that people rejected the decision of Superman and that's what doomed it. People did reject it, but it took a lot more expensive failures in building a DC extended universe from Warner Brothers to bury Superman for good in this iteration of it. Because after this, we're in full franchise mode. There is a very troubled production of Justice League that I don't want to go into because I spent too much time in my life knowing that this was a thing. Zack Snyder, who directs Man of Steel, comes back for Batman vs. Superman, returns as the director for the Justice League, ends up leaving the production because of a death in his family, is replaced by Avengers director Joss Whedon, who turns in one of the worst movies I've seen in my life.
He Richard Lester's it.
Yes,
yep.
Absolutely Richard Lester's it. The movie's an ungodly mess. A collection of the saddest people on the internet campaign for Zack Snyder to get a second shot at it. Warner Brothers gives him the chance years later. During the pandemic, we get the HBO Max, whatever the hell they're calling it, the digital release of Zack Snyder's Justice League, which is like 4 hours long and only marginally better than the garbage that preceded it.
I would argue that it's significantly. I think it's significantly better.
Significantly better.
Different movie. Totally different movie.
I don't think it saves it. I couldn't make it. No, I'm not going to say it's even like on the same standing. It improves upon it. It makes sense at least.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In a way that a 4.5 hour long movie kind of has to make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to say I'm a big fan, but I think it is and it's impossible to say like, oh, this version would have succeeded because they would never have released this version to theaters. It would have
never been theatrical, ever in a billion years.
But that doesn't matter. The fact is that it exists and it is better than what they released theatrically. So that's where I land on it.
Do you guys like Superman's supporting role in this movie that really tries to tackle the other part of the Death of Superman storyline in like a 20-minute Spark Notes version, and then turns into a Rock'em Sock'em ensemble movie.
I liked Superman's appearance. He suddenly did have that Superman, like, I feel like a hero, like I am the guy vibe to him that
Yeah.
I feel that we were missing before. It was weird, that the world mourning Superman in this movie, when in Batman versus Superman they spent so much time being like, we don't like Superman.
We changed
So
our
just to-
minds.
yeah. So to have him just be like, the guy again was really nice. But again, it all comes down to Clark and Lois.
Yeah.
Batman versus Superman, we didn't get a lot. In Man of Steel, I felt like we had a strong connection there. She finally got to be with Superman. There was no like, I don't know who you are because you're wearing glasses. We just knew right out the gate. And then, it's just another movie of waiting the whole time for them to get back together in Justice League.
This is a good observation in that I think Man of Steel uses economy of storytelling very well in that there's no kryptonite in Man of Steel.
Yeah.
There's no Lex Luthor in Man of Steel. You don't waste time
Clark.
introducing story elements to say I did it. There's no place to fit that in. So in Batman versus Superman, you stuff it full of all of these other things where it becomes unwieldy. And by the time you get to Justice League, the Whedon thing is just so obscenely awful that it's hard to take seriously. And yes, there is an improvement in the 4-hour plus version that's streaming, the famed Snyder cut. But I think it's a big ask to have audiences sit through that to get glimpses of movies that could have been that just get jam-packed into this weird streaming movie hybrid.
I mean, there's no question it is a thing for fans.
Yeah.
And I'm fine with that. Again, as I said before, I'm a proponent of filmmakers getting studios to spend a lot of money to do something crazy. And that is exactly what this is. And it's like, I find a lot of the online fandom for Snyder's movies to be really frustrating.
I don't get it, man. I honestly don't get it. I love the Dawn of the Dead thing. I thought Watchmen was as good a try as you can do as a movie.
Sure.
It's a hard assignment. You can't succeed with that. I thought Man of Steel was great. Guys, calm down.
300's a great adaptation.
Yeah,
but that rabid sort of like foaming at the mouth following over the I don't get it. Good for him. He's had a great career, wonderful filmmaker, but I just don't get that element of the fandom.
Well, and what I was going to say is the back half of that is like, that is not the movies, and the movies are not necessarily for me either, but I kind of, Batman versus Superman, like, no, man, that's a mess. But with the full Justice League, it's like, okay, great, it's out there. I'm glad that people get to see it in the same way that I'm glad that people get to see the Donner version of Superman 2, even if it's not better. I'm glad they spent the money to finish it and it's out there.
What killed me about Batman versus Superman was I feel like I really like the pacing in Man of Steel. Especially with the Hans Zimmer score in that. Oh my God, I love that score so much. It's a good score. And it just keeps pushing us through. It's a good mix of like, we get Krypton, we get young Clark, we get the flashbacks in the modern day, and we get, Jor-El in his AI form walking around helping out without it, being projected on a crystal wall or something. That it feels like a real character.
Yeah, no Wizard of Oz called it.
And everyone's like introduced in an organic way, where in Batman versus Superman it is, and here we are looking at a computer screen again.
Yeah.
So if we had, Wonder Woman introducing the Justice League rather than Batman pulling them together, the one superhero who is known for being the loner who sits alone in a cave, not wanting to talk to people.
Right.
Maybe if Wonder Woman had already the Themyscirans and the Amazons already knew the Atlanteans, so they had a connection there with Aquaman, or she found some of them already and could bring them into the fold. It would have felt a little better.
Yep.
Yeah, a mess of a movie. Tragically outside of the scope of having a real shot at this movie, right? I think the production difficulties do influence in what ends up getting made, and there was a second chance with that streaming stab with the Snyder cut. Ultimately, we still had more DCEU titles after this. It's not like after Justice League disappointed at the box office, and this one did disappoint, by the way. It opened under 100 million, and it's up topping out at 229 domestically in a 2017 where it feels like most people that would have watched this movie weren't really in the bag for it at all. Oddly enough, it's not like they ever went back and were like, hey, maybe now is a good time to go back and rebuild things with Man of Steel 2. They went and gave Wonder Woman a sequel. They went and gave Aquaman a sequel. We got something called the Blue Beetle, but no indication Superman would ever come back. Eventually, Superman does a cameo in, I think, Black Adam, was it? That he shows up at the end for a second?
Yeah.
We see his body in Shazam.
Yes.
Holding a lunch tray.
Yeah.
We go from Superman, we go from Man of Steel to, honestly, a Black Adam cameo. By the time that The Flash comes out, which was last summer, they revive aspects of Man of Steel, and they introduce Supergirl for that movie in a performance that I think kind of works. I think when they find Supergirl, where is it, in Siberia? I found that it seemed to be interesting. The awful VFX work in the final battle sequence of The Flash ruins things, I think, for lots of folks. But it also gives us a glimpse of not only the George Reeve Superman, the Christopher Reeve Superman, but also Nicolas Cage.
Yes.
The unmade Superman Lives Tim Burton film, finally fighting a giant spider. It runs out of juice after Justice League. And somehow this centerpiece of DC Comics, the centerpiece of Warner Brothers, this centerpiece of comic book movies gets reduced to a cameo. And now we'll get rebooted again this weekend with the release of James Gunn's Superman. We're apprehensive, and I think everyone listening to this understands why.
I'm not. I'm excited. I'm hyped for this. Nonstop hype.
I'm hopeful.
I mean, Russ, are you looking forward to it yourself after this 30-plus year history? Nearly 50-year plus history that we have with this character on the movie screen.
Absolutely. Before every Superman thing, I'm going in with a true Superman mentality of hope and seeing the best in this. I love me a James Gunn movie. I love the Guardians franchise. So I'm excited to see this, and then just seeing what he's done with Peacemaker and Creature Commandos. I'm like, yeah, put it in his hands. I'm having a good time.
I have a lot of questions. Russ, to me, the trailer seems bloated. When we saw footage of this at CinemaCon, James Gunn spent the entire time talking about his dog. Yeah, man, I don't know. I'm gonna go see it. Are you looking forward to it, Russ?
I'm very curious. As Diogo is, I am hopeful, and I want to remain hopeful. Things that give me pause are leaning on the dog for the trailer, which seems like
there was so much dog at CinemaCon.
which to me,
do you think all the footage of the dog is in the trailer? Get ready for more dog, man.
And
unless they got caught.
I'm fine with the dog being in the movie, but it does just seem like it's like the safest possible kind of ploy, and it does make me worried. And also, again, like I would like it to be a Superman movie rather than a team movie. And the number of additional characters who are in this film has me concerned, because that means that's all time taken away from being a Superman movie. And so, yeah, that part, I'm curious, but cautious.
Cautious is the right word to use as we wrap up this episode. Thank you very much, Diogo and Russ, for your 2 hours plus of recording. We always run. I am late for a meeting. I have to go take care of that. Wait till I tell him I was talking about Superman movies.
Yes.
Showing up. Thank you for listening, and we will come back with another episode of the Box Office Podcast next Thursday.